You can watch. I had a debate with Robert Spencer on this. Robert Spencer concluded that Muhammad probably never existed. He may have existed as that there was some guy named Muhammad,
Right.
but as far as the stories, you know, the what Muslims believe about Muhammad,
Right.
it's just has very little resemblance to the same person if he existed at all.
Right.
And the sort of general reason for that is that you know, we have a ton of first century sources on the life of Jesus. Muslims have almost nothing for the first century of Islam, right? I mean, you have to make some very stretched arguments to get a case that this is about Muhammad or that's about Muhammad.
Right.
And notice the difference, right? You're talking about Jesus. Jesus is a first century carpenter.
Right.
Why would we have so many sources about a first century carpenter? We
Right,
obviously made an impact. But historically, there's almost nothing.
Right.
You try and figure out if anything is, if any of these mentions even have anything to do with Muhammad.
Right.
I can't base my case on early sources because
Right.
Ibn Ishaq, their earliest detailed biographical source, is written more than a century after Muhammad's death. Now think about that.
Right.
We as Christians don't go to any
Yeah.
source that's
Yeah.
written more than a century after
Right.
Jesus' death. And that's a source that Muslims say that's a bad, corrupt source. You can't
Yeah.
trust that. You have to go to these later sources,
Right,
or even later. So
Right,
the
right.
sources that Muslims go to are from generally 2 to 3 centuries after the time of Muhammad. They're going to these for their information. And so I can't just say, okay, these sources are good because they're so early. Historians are usually looking for early sources. They're looking for multiple independent sources, right? Not just one guy saying something, but multiple sources saying something. That's the kind of thing you're looking for, and you don't have that with Islam.
Right.
And so the question is, do you have anything else that you can fall back on? And so in my debate with Robert Spencer, I actually had to fall back on the principle of embarrassment, which is if you were inventing something, are there things in the Muslim sources that no one who's inventing something would invent?
Right. Right.
And so I started pointing things like this out, like the satanic verses, right? Muslims spent centuries of Islam trying to explain away the satanic verses. Well, what's the point of putting it in there?
Right.
If you're just going to try to explain it away.
Right.
They spend centuries.
Assalamu alaikum and hello to my non-Muslim viewers. Today I'm going to be talking about the historical Prophet Muhammad, or the historical Muhammad, and this is a response to critics. So here we go. Critics like Robert Spencer and David Wood. So here we go. Robert Spencer, back in 2012, I think, wrote a book called Did Muhammad Exist? And he says that most of the stories about the Prophet Muhammad, you know, he concludes that Prophet Muhammad didn't exist, and you know, the stories of the Prophet Muhammad and things like that were just made up in the hadith. We're just making up stories about the Prophet Muhammad and stuff like that. So you know how people say that some people say that there was no Moses and Jesus didn't exist and stuff like that. There was no historical Jesus, or there was no historical Moses, or Abraham, or you know, because you know, critics of the Bible say, yeah, Jesus probably didn't exist, and Moses, Abraham, you know, Adam and Eve and all those, Noah, all those people probably didn't exist. Well, Robert Spencer's trying to copy off those critics and say, yeah, Muhammad probably didn't exist. And this was back, what, I think 6 years ago, 2012 or something like that. So anyways, the thing is that, you know, the critics are saying, you know, the critics like Robert Spencer and others say that, yeah, there probably was no Muhammad, and, you know, a lot of the stories about him were made up and stuff like that. And is this true? No, it isn't. Now, in order to refute, I'm going to be playing a clip. I'm going to be playing some clips where, you know, David Wood says that, you know, we have very late sources when it comes to Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, the Hadith, and Ibn Ishaq, and al-Waqidi, even Sa'd al-Tabari. All these biographical sources and these Hadith sources come, you know, 120 or 200 years later, and you know, things like that. You know, and there's nothing in the first 200 years of Islam, or 120 years. There's nothing between the Prophet Muhammad and Ibn Ishaq or al-Bukhari. What he alleges is that there's nothing in between those times. And I think Robert Spencer also makes that case and stuff like that, where he says there's no description of Muhammad, or there's no, you know, artifacts or coins, ancient coins mentioning the Prophet Muhammad, or anything Islamic, like Quran verses and stuff like that, or, you know, manuscripts of the Quran and stuff like that. But I'm not going to be talking about the preservation of the Quran in this video. I did that in previous videos. I'm just going to be sticking to the historical Muhammad. So how do we know the Prophet Muhammad existed? Well, this is a very easy thing to refute. We do have first century mentions. We do have very early mentions of the Prophet Muhammad, coming out of, coming from, the very early first century of Islam, and I'm going to be citing that right now. We know that the Prophet Muhammad existed because there's some sources talking about the Prophet Muhammad's life and things like that. So and these are not historical founders. These are not friendly. These aren't friends of Islam and stuff like that. So we have first century mentions of the Prophet Muhammad, and the earliest first century mention we have of the Prophet Muhammad would be the Doctrine Akubi Nupur Baptiza, which was written in 13 to 20 after Hijrah. So basically there was a very early source that talks about the prophet who has appeared among the Sakarians. The Sakarians are the Arabs, another name for the Arabs. And this source is found in a record of the Arab conquest of Syria in 637 CE, and Thomas the Proselyter in 640 CE. So this is among the very earliest non-Islamic sources to mention the Prophet Muhammad. So, and this was in 13 and 20 after Hijrah, in 634 and 640 CE. So roughly around 2 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, we have a mention of him. There's also a mention of him in the record of the Arab conquest of Syria, which happened in 15 to 16 after Hijrah, in 635 Christian era, where it says the Arabs of Muhammad. And this is found in a very early source. This is found in a very early Greek or very early Roman source. So this is there's a very early source very early Byzantine source, and the Byzantine source was Theodore. So and another very early mention of Muhammad would be Thomas the Proselyter in 19 after Hijrah and 640 CE, where he says the Arabs of Muhammad. So this means the time period between the death of Muhammad, which was in June 632 CE, and the earliest mention of him, which was February 4th, 634 CE, is only about a year and a half, or about 2 years or a year and a half there from the funeral of Prophet Muhammad to the earliest mention. There's a very early mentions of him within a year and a half. And Severus, the bishop of Baguritas, in 660 CE, said that there was somebody named Muhammad. And so these are very early sources that talk about the life of Muhammad. We have very early sources talking about him. So this claim that there's no mention of him for 120 years or 200 years or whatever is false. But what about what he says about the first 200 years of Islam, and that there's no there's no records of Muhammad in the first, or there's no hadith or biographies of the Prophet Muhammad from his death to all the way to 120 years. So Ibn Ishaq wrote his biography 120 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, and critics of Islam say, yeah, well, the biography of Muhammad is 120 years later, so how can you Muslims go to something that's 120 years later? Christians don't accept anything that late. And is that true? No, it isn't. So many of the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad wrote down hadith, unlike the disciples of Jesus. For example, we have Abdullah bin Amr wrote a manuscript of hadith. Ali, one of the main disciples of Prophet Muhammad, wrote down a hadith. Abu Huraira also wrote down a hadith. Anas bin Malik wrote down hadith books. Ibn Abbas wrote a bunch of books, a bunch of hadith books, and a bunch of biography books. Jabir bin Abdullah wrote down a bunch of books, etc., etc. So we have disciples of Prophet Muhammad or companions of Prophet Muhammad writing down hadith books and writing down biographies and stuff like that. But you might say, well, what happened to these biographies? How come we don't have them today and stuff like that? Well, the reason why is because those biographies died out, or they didn't die out. They were destroyed, or they were lost. They were absorbed. So Sahih Bukhari, so Ibn Ishaq, Al-Tabari, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, all these people, they absorbed these early works into their works. So it's not true that for the first 200 years or 120 years there's no mention of Muhammad. That's completely false. There's a bunch of mentions of Prophet Muhammad all over, all over by non-Muslim sources, and we have very early hadith compilations of companions of the Prophet, and we have very early biographies and stuff like that. For example, Ibn Ishaq wrote down things from other sources, like Musa ibn Iqbal and stuff like that. Most of the time, Ibn Ishaq doesn't provide any kind of chain of transmission and stuff like that. So that's why most of his work is weak to begin with, or it's not a good historical source. But Ibn Ishaq did consult earlier biographies, for example, Musa ibn Iqbal and other people, which we don't have today. Those very early historical books that were written by disciples of Prophet Muhammad or disciples of Prophet Muhammad are gone, they're lost. We don't have them today. So I'm going to be posting a link down to all the links that mention that have early where you can see that there were earlier biographies of the Prophet Muhammad before Ibn Ishaq, and early hadith compilations, and text mentioning the Prophet Muhammad, text mentioning the Prophet Muhammad from a year and a half of his death. So we have very early sources mentioning the Prophet Muhammad. We have very early hadith books and compilations, and we have very early biographies of the Prophet Muhammad and things like that. And and David Wood says we have first century sources of Jesus, of a carpenter named Jesus and stuff like that. Well, I would have to argue, just because the New Testament books are early, that doesn't mean it's reliable. You have New Testament documents written in the first century, some in the second century. That's true, but at the same time, we don't know who wrote most of the New Testament, and we don't know who the sources are. So how can we trust the New Testament if we don't know who wrote it and we don't know who their sources are? So that makes the New Testament unreliable. That's not the case with the Quran or the Hadith or the biographies, because all the Hadith have chains of transmissions that goes back to the disciples. It goes back to the Prophet Muhammad, and then we have biographies that also were absorbed by earlier biographies that go back to that disciples of Prophet Muhammad wrote, who got their stories from either the first generation or the second generation. Now, not everything in the biographies of the Prophet Muhammad are reliable. I'll admit that. Like, there's a lot of false stories about the Prophet Muhammad, not only the Prophet Muhammad, but the disciples or the companions of Prophet Muhammad, found in Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Sa'd, Al-Tabari, Al-Waqidi, etc. So all these four biography sources are weak, because there's chainless, there's isnadless stories, or there's chainless stories in those sources. I'll admit that, but the hadith all go back to the Prophet Muhammad. This is a fact, because Bukhari included in his work earlier hadith and earlier chains of transmission that were from the very beginning of the Prophet Muhammad. So it goes to Prophet Muhammad, it goes to his disciples, it goes to companions of the Prophet Muhammad. The companions of the Prophet Muhammad wrote down books, and then the second generation got those books and then wrote down their books, and then the other generation got those books from the first two generations and wrote down isnads, or chains of transmissions, going all the way back to Umar bin Khattab and Abu Bakr and Abu Huraira, who were direct companions or direct disciples of Prophet Muhammad. And then it goes Sahih Bukhari. Sahih Bukhari took all those three generations of hadith books from Ibn Abbas, Abu Bakr, or Abu Huraira and stuff like that, and he took the first two generations of hadith books and he put it into Sahih Bukhari and stuff like that. And same with Sahih Muslim, and same with Abu Dawud, and same with Tirmidhi and all those people. So all those hadith collections that came 200 years later, or 200 years after the Prophet Muhammad, took a lot of earlier sources and absorbed it and put it into their works and stuff like that. But you might be saying, well, does that mean everything in Sahih Bukhari and everything in Ibn Majah and everything in Tirmidhi goes back to the Prophet Muhammad? No, there are some weak chains of transmission in Bukhari. Even in Bukhari, there's weak hadith, and there's weak hadith in Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawud, and stuff like that. So sometimes chains of transmissions don't always go back to the Prophet Muhammad. Sometimes there are people in the middle of the chain of transmission who either had bad memory or were known liars or were making up stories about the Prophet Muhammad for political reasons or whatever. So there are sometimes, and same thing with Ibn Ishaq, so people would make up stories about the Prophet Muhammad, like the satanic verses or the Zainab bin Jahsh story. They would make up these stories and they would put them into Ibn Ishaq, al-Tabari, and Ibn Sa'd. They would make up these stories and put it into these books like Ibn Ishaq, al-Tabari, and stuff like that. So people would, of course, make up stories like the satanic verses and stuff like that for it was either for political reasons, or there were hypocrites in the middle of the chains of transmission, or in the early two generations of Islam, there were hypocrites, people pretending to be Muslims who wanted to spread lies about the Prophet Muhammad, and so people would make up these good stories and these bad stories about the Prophet Muhammad for political reasons, or either for political reasons, or they would do it for personal gain, or they would do it for so people would make up these stories for either personal reasons or political reasons, or they just hated Islam, so they wanted to make up bad stories about the Prophet Muhammad, or they would do it for religious reasons. So for example, you have some Jews and some Jews in the chains of transmissions of or Jews and Shias and chains of transmissions in Bukhari and Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari and stuff like that. So these Jews and Shias would make up bad stories about either Aisha or Abu Bakr or Umar al-Khattab or the Prophet Muhammad. Either Jews would make up these bad stories about the Prophet Muhammad, and then Ibn Ishaq would record those stories. For example, there's a story in Ibn Ishaq, page 515, where the Prophet Muhammad tortures a man with fire and flint for money. And this is found in Ibn Ishaq, page 515, and David Wood and Robert Spencer always mentioned this story. But the problem with that story is that there's no chain of transmission, and it's possible that that story came from Jews, because the Jews hated Islam and stuff like that. So of course these enemies of Islam would make up these bad stories about the Prophet Muhammad because they hated Islam. They just want to make Islam look bad or the Prophet Muhammad look bad. So of course they're going to make up these not flattering stories. Of course, why not? And back in those times, people had nothing to do but make up stories and stuff like that. So Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari and stuff like that, they would just write these stories down because they didn't care if it was true or not. They just wanted to record whatever they thought was history. So they weren't like historians, they weren't like professional historians. They were just writing down wherever they heard or without verifying it. But that's not the case with that. Most of the time that wasn't the case with Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. Most of the times Bukhari and Muslim were more careful in their compiling their stories or their hadith about the Prophet Muhammad. But does that mean that everything in Sahih Bukhari, everything in Sahih Muslim, everything in Sunan Abu Dawud is etc. is correct? No, because there are some footnotes in Sahih Bukhari saying that there's weak hadith or there's broken chains of transmissions and stuff like that. So if you read the Arabic version of Bukhari, you can find this in his footnotes. For example, there's a story where the Prophet Muhammad tried to commit suicide, and this is found in Sahih Bukhari. But Bukhari admits in the bottom of that hadith that there's a weak chain of transmission, or we don't know who the people in the middle of the chain of transmission were and stuff like that. So even Bukhari mentions that story of Prophet Muhammad committing suicide is false, yet that story somehow made it to Bukhari. Bukhari still mentions it. So of course there are weak hadith in Sahih Bukhari. There are broken chains too. So Bukhari is not 100% infallible, or it's not 100%. Bukhari is not the inspired word of God or whatever. So sometimes even Sahih Bukhari and Muslim, they would make mistakes. You can read hadith commentaries of Ibn Hajar and Imam Nawawi where they point this stuff out. Obviously, I'm trying to make this video short, so I don't have time to get into it, but I'm going to be posting links below where that talk about that. So that's all I want to say about the history of the Prophet Muhammad. We Muslims can be confident that the Prophet Muhammad existed and stuff like that. Now, not every story of the Prophet Muhammad is true, and not every hadith is true. I'll admit that, but there was a man in the 5th and 6th century Arabia, Muhammad. He did exist, and of course people made up stories about him after his death, just like people made up stories about Jesus after Jesus. Of course people would make up stories after Prophet Muhammad, just like people made up stories about Moses after Moses. So people would make up these stories. Same thing with Abraham. When Abraham died, there was all kinds of stories about him. Even non-canonical biblical stories. For example, if you read the Book of Jubilees and stuff like that, there's all kinds of stories about Abraham and and then Adam and Eve and Enoch and stuff like that. There are these non-canonical stories of Adam and Enoch and stuff like that found in 1 Enoch, and there's even a life of Adam and Eve and stuff like that. So of course, these Jews back, in biblical times, even before Christ, even before Jesus, Jews were making up stories about their figures and their, heroes and stuff, figures like Moses, Elijah, Adam and Eve, Enoch, and Abraham. So Jews were making up stories and putting it into the Talmud and these non-canonical biblical stories, these non-canonical biblical books and stuff like that. There's a bunch of Jewish pseudographical or apocryphal books like the life of Adam and Eve, 1 Enoch, and things like that, and the Book of Jubilees. So there's all these kinds of extra non-canonical Old Testament Jewish books that talk about Adam and Eve and Enoch and Elijah and Abraham and Noah and stuff like that didn't make it into the Old Testament. So that's further proof that these Israelites or these Jews would make up stories and stuff like that about their figures, about their beloved figures like Moses, Abraham, Solomon, Noah and stuff like that. So of course people did that with Jesus too. There's all kinds of non-canonical New Testament books that didn't make it into the New Testament that say all kinds of things about Jesus and stuff like that. For example, there's the Gospel of Peter, there's the Apocalypse of Peter, the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter, the Gospel of Nicodemus, that contain all these extra stories of Jesus that didn't make it into the canon of the New Testament. The New Testament scholars say, yeah, that's because most of the stories they're either fabricated or there's no way they go back to Jesus or stuff like that. So of course people would make up stories. So Jews and stuff like that would make up stories about Moses, Abraham, Isaac, et cetera, and circulate these things in non-canonical biblical thing in the biblical canon. And same thing with early Christians. They would make up stories about not only Jesus but Peter, James, John, etc. So people would make up these stories about Jesus and his disciples, after the New Testament or during the early times of Christianity. And of course, people would make up these stories about the Prophet Muhammad during the early times of the Prophet Muhammad, and in later times, 200 years or 120 years after, and stuff like that. And not only would they make up stories about the Prophet Muhammad, but they would make up stories about Umar bin Khattab, Abu Bakr, the disciples of Prophet Muhammad, Ali, and stuff like that. So Shias have all kinds of fanciful legends of Ali and stuff like that, but there's these are fabricated or weak sources. Muslims don't, Sunni or Orthodox Muslims don't take these stories seriously. So every religion has stories and legends and myths about their founders and about the main figures, and the Prophet Muhammad is no different. There are fabricated stories about the Prophet Muhammad. Same not only with the Abrahamic religions, but you can find this with Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, all these ancient Indian religions that predate the Abrahamic religions. There are mythical stories about the Aryan invasion in the Hindu Vedas. There are stories about there's fictional stories about Buddha, and these other these other other Eastern figures and stuff like that. So of course people would make up stories. And back in those times, people had nothing to do but make up either these good stories or these not or these bad stories or these not flattering stories. So and then he talks about the criteria of embarrassment, where why would people make up these not flattering stories about Jesus or the Prophet Muhammad and stuff like that? Well, the reason why is because they had a motive to do so. They wanted to either make they had a political motive to make up these stories or these bad stories about the Prophet Muhammad, like the satanic verses and stuff like that. So the criteria of embarrassment doesn't work. It doesn't work with Christianity. It doesn't work with Islam, because of course people would make up these bad stories during the time of Jesus or after the time of Jesus, and people would make up these bad stories after the time of Prophet Muhammad, and people would make up bad stories about Moses, David, Elijah, whatever, etc., for a lot of reasons, for either political reasons or religious reasons or personal reasons or economical reasons. Like, who knows what the reasons were for people making up these stories, but they would make up these stories about for example, a good example in the New Testament is women going to the tomb. So Christian apologists say, yeah, that's a criteria of embarrassment, because why would the gospel authors say women go to the tomb instead of men? So that makes the story more credible, because why would the gospel authors put women put women in a more important position than men? Because women back in those New Testament times, or those Jewish times, or those New Testament times, were looked as not reliable. So that makes the story credible, and that story, that's wildly false. Of course people would make up, of course the gospel, or whoever wrote the gospel, Mark and Matthew and stuff like that, would make up the story of women going to the tomb for a reason. I can't get into that reason right now, but I would just recommend people seeing my interview with Dr. Richard Carrier on this, where he talks about women going to the tomb instead of men, and why the criteria of embarrassment doesn't work, and why people would make up these not good stories and these good stories about Jesus and stuff like that. And that's a whole other topic. I would just recommend people seeing my interview with Dr. Richard Carrier on that topic, which I'll post down below. So of course people make up stories about the Prophet Muhammad and stuff like that. That's just the way it was back then. So we do have good. So in conclusions, we do have good sources talking about the Prophet Muhammad, and we have texts, or very early texts mentioning him and stuff like that. So we can be confident that Prophet Muhammad existed. But not every story, not every hadith about the Prophet Muhammad is correct. There are some good stories there is good history of Muhammad, and there is bad history of Muhammad. What I mean bad history, I mean there's weak and fabricated stories about the Prophet Muhammad, just like Jesus. Just like there's fabrications in the New Testament too. For example, the story of Jesus. The story of the women, the story in the Gospel of John about Jesus forgiving the women who are Mary Magdalene when she did when the Jews were going to stone her and stuff like that. That story has been proven. That story in the Gospel of John has been proven to be a fabrication. So of course, so there were scribes in the New Testament making up these stories and putting it into the text of the New Testament, or the Gospel of Mark, where it says Jesus got angry with the leper. And then later on, scribes changed it to he felt compassion. So that's further proof that people were making up stories about Jesus and putting it into the manuscripts of the New Testament. A good book, again, would be Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, where he talks about how scribes would change the text to insert stories about Jesus and stuff like that. But that's a whole other topic, which I can't get into. So that just so we can be confident that the Prophet Muhammad existed. We can be confident that the Quran goes back to the Prophet Muhammad. And, a lot of these Sahih Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, all these sources go back to the Prophet Muhammad. A good biography that took out a lot of the weak stories of the Prophet Muhammad would be Ibn Ehteshaam. So Ibn Ehteshaam wrote down a biography of the Prophet Muhammad, and he took out a lot of weak stories and found in Ibn Ishaq's work. So that's a good biography to read. And that came, in Ibn Ehteshaam, I think came at least 140 years after the Prophet Muhammad, if I'm not mistaken, and he absorbed earlier biographies of the Prophet Muhammad into his manuscript or into his work. It's called Ibn Hisham, and I think he wrote 4 volumes, if I'm not mistaken, about the Prophet Muhammad. So I would just recommend, so if anybody wants the correct history of the Prophet Muhammad from the early sources, I would just recommend Ibn Hisham over Ibn Ishaq. So that's all I want to say about the history of the Prophet Muhammad. Thanks a lot.